God does desire unity. He wants his people to be unified. However, what typically happens is when God's people come together and there's unity, they gather as one person, they do things with one spirit and one mind, there's an influence that starts to creep in, and Satan has a way of putting his foot in the door. That's usually described as being leaven in the scriptures. And this leavening influence increases and grows, and when it increases and grows, inevitably what you're going to have is some sort of division, either widespread or localized. And so that's why we're going to be talking about this tonight, is because that's not always necessarily a bad thing. In the scriptures, we looked at this morning, Jesus being the Prince of Peace, and he came into the world to be this Prince of Peace, to give peace to all of mankind. There's also other passages, though, such as in Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus said, "Don't think I came to bring peace, but rather a sword." And he says that the person's enemies are actually going to be those even of his own household. And so the division that we're talking about can come about very, very personally, very close to us, and it's not meant to be looked at as just being something that happens out there. It's something that's very real. And oftentimes, it's a result of being unified with Christ that we have division with others. So what is supposed to be our viewpoint of that? And I do want to be transparent and upfront from the beginning that there are going to be some things tonight that are probably going to hit very close to home for many of us. I've been here 10 years, and it's been relatively peaceful that entire 10 years. There's been, dust-ups with individuals and some different little groups here and there. But relatively speaking, it's been very peaceful. But when I came here, it was on the heels of something that was very brutal for a lot of people. And there was questions that lingered then that needed to be answered and addressed. And even over the past year, those same types of questions come up continually and need to be addressed. What's our responsibility? What's our relationship supposed to be like? How do we view those that have caused issues and problems in the past? Even if it wasn't sinful and rose to the level of being marked, what are we supposed to do in those situations? So again, as I go through this lesson, we cannot help but understand that it's going to have some very real application for many of us as we go through that. But that's why it's good for us to study it, because we don't want to shy away from anything that God tells us about. And so when we go through God's Word, and as we've been looking at, peace is something that God gives. It is our responsibility to accept what it is that God gives in relationship to that peace, how that peace comes about, and it has to be founded upon absolute truth. Anything else other than that, any other framework other than that, is not going to yield the peace that God is talking about or that God offers. This is the only way for it to be achieved. And so we do, though, have many times people who they just want to get along. Can't we just all get along with everyone? Why do we have to point out differences? Why is it that we have to talk about issues and problems that we've had with individuals or groups of people or religious groups and things? A lot of people don't like that, and that's understandable. It's not a popular thing to talk about. I mean, it's a lot more fun to get up here and talk about how good and wonderful and peaceful God's people are and what that brings about and bursts forth in our hearts in song because of it. But the harsh reality is that's only half the story. The other half is this, is that there are times where peace is not appropriate. When you have passages like in Isaiah, let's go there first, Isaiah chapter 30. And we're going to spend the first part of this lesson looking at several passages in the Old Testament. But in Isaiah 30, the children of Israel being in captivity because of their sinfulness, God having to talk about the rebellion and the rebellious spirit that they have. He talks about this in Isaiah 30 and verse 8 where God says, "Now go and write it before them on a tablet and note it on a scroll, that it may be for time to come forever and ever, that this is a rebellious people, lying children, children who will not hear the law of the Lord, who say to the seers, 'Do not see,' and to the prophets, 'Do not prophesy to us right things.' Instead, what they were saying is, 'Speak to us smooth things, prophesy deceits. Get out of the way, turn aside from the path, cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us.'" Now my question is this the actual words that the people were speaking? Is this what they were actually saying? I'm very doubtful about that. We run into circumstances and situations and individuals that would say that and demonstrate that throughout their lives. More than anything else, I believe what God is pointing out is this is the kinds of things that they're saying. Don't be pointing out these hard issues. Don't be pointing out these sinful activities. Don't be pointing out the error of our ways. Don't prophesy to us hard and difficult things. Speak to us easy things, smooth words. In the verses that were read for us in Jeremiah chapter 5 that Travis read for us a moment ago, notice that it says that the people want this deceitfulness. They want these lies to be spoken. They want to ignore and pretend like things have not happened and things have not transpired to bring about their demise as a nation and as God's people. And it says, and the people love to have it so. And so the religious leaders themselves will even take advantage of certain situations like that because they see a people who are vulnerable, people who are gullible, people who just want to have relief from the warfare that they see going on around them or for whatever reason. And the people love to have it so. In chapter 6, he continues that same idea when you get down to verses 12 through 17. Actually, I want to back up to verse 10 of Jeremiah 6. To whom shall I speak and give warning that they may hear? Indeed, their ear is uncircumcised, and they cannot give heed. Behold, the word of the Lord is a reproach to them. They have no delight in it. Therefore, I am full of the fury of the Lord. I am weary of holding it in. I will pour it out on the children outside and on the assembly of young men together, for even the husband shall be taken with the wife, the aged with him who is full of days. And their houses, verse 12 says, shall be turned over to others, fields and wives together. For I will stretch out my hand against the inhabitants of the land, says the Lord. Because from the least of them, even to the greatest of them, everyone is given to covetousness. And from the prophet even to the priest, everyone deals falsely. They have also healed the hurt of my people slightly, saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. Were they ashamed at all when they had committed abomination? No, they were not at all ashamed, nor do they know how to blush. Therefore they shall fall among those who fall. At the time I punish them, they shall be cast down, says the Lord. In verse 16, stand in the ways and see, says the Lord, and ask for the old paths where the good way is, and walk in it. Then you will find rest for your souls. O generation, what is among them? Hear, O earth, behold, I will certainly bring calamity on this people, the fruit of their thoughts, because they have not heeded my words. And on and on and on he goes through this discourse and talking about how it is that this destruction is coming because these people don't want to hear the truth. At the beginning of chapter 5, he tells the prophet to go out into the streets, find one person who wants to hear the truth. And he couldn't. It sounds a lot worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. And the reason being is not just because of the sinfulness that was there. Cutting out the sinfulness was not going to be the absolute solution. But what you also had to cut out was this idea of peace, peace, where there is no peace. Don't worry about it. Let's just get along. Let's not talk about that. Let's just ignore this thing that's happening. Let's just get along with those who are a part of it. And let's not deal with that issue. It'll just go away. It doesn't happen that way. And that's what God is warning about. You cannot heal an injury by pretending it does not exist. They healed the hurt of my people slightly. You have this huge gaping wound. And I say, well, let me, kiss it and make it better. That doesn't work. But spiritually speaking, that's what happens so many times. There's this huge thing. There's this huge mindset that's at work. And we say, well, it's not a big deal. It is a big deal because of where it leads. And so as we're talking about this, it is a matter of maturity that we have to understand that God is not pleased with all peace. And I think there's a really good example of this in 1 Kings chapter 12 and 13. 1 Kings chapter 12 and 13. When you get there, you'll notice that this is where there's a revolt against Rehoboam. You remember that Solomon has passed away. His son Rehoboam is going to be coronated as the king. This man named Jeroboam had previously led a revolt against Solomon in chapter 11. But here in chapter 12, as Rehoboam is about to be anointed as the king, Jeroboam comes with a bunch of people. And Jeroboam says to Rehoboam, the burden that your father laid upon us was a really heavy burden. But if you'll release this burden, if you'll ease this burden up, then we and all the people will follow you. And so this kingdom that's been unified through its heyday of David and Solomon is now on the brink of having this huge split and division. And Rehoboam's given the opportunity to take advantage of something where this person who's been revolting against his father says, I will be unified with you if you could just release some of this burden that's upon us. And you remember what Rehoboam does. He goes to the elders, he goes to the older, the wiser, and they tell him, yes, do what it is he's asking you to do, and you'll have the heart of this people. But instead, he turns to the younger. And the younger ones around his age that are his friends, his running buddies, they say, no, make it even worse. And the kingdom splits. Now, here's my question for you. Of the two, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, which would you want more to follow after? If you were at that time, who would you have followed and wanted to follow? Jeroboam, who was saying, look, this burden is too heavy, it needs to be lightened. And the older people says, yes, he's right. Or Rehoboam, who doesn't listen to them, but turns to the younger and says, I'm going to increase it. Here's the problem with following emotions. I would rather follow Jeroboam. In many ways, he seemed to be a man of more integrity, a man of more foresight, a man who was strong enough to stand up for what he said that he believed in. But here's the problem with that. Jeroboam was in error for what he did. And there was a mindset behind Jeroboam that was rebellious against the king that he was supposed to be obeying. The people were supposed to worship in Jerusalem, in Judah. And the mindset of Jeroboam led to, we get to chapter 13, at the end of chapter 12 and into chapter 13, the establishment of these golden calves, one at Dan and one at Bethel. One central and one southern. That way, if you were going down to Jerusalem, you could see this other one. Well, I'll just stop and I'll worship here because it's more convenient. Or you could go in the other direction and to worship. That's the problem with following emotion. I would emotionally want to follow Jeroboam. I would agree with what he's saying. But God says that it's in Jerusalem that these things are supposed to happen. And you remember what takes place because of that? The nation splits as a result. And the nation is always at war within itself because of the split that happens here in chapters 12 and in chapter 13. When you get over to chapter 22, however, there's an occasion where it seems like maybe there's going to be a getting back together of the two nations. 3 years, it says, passes in verse 22 without war between Syria and Israel, chapter 22, verse 1. And it came to pass in the 3rd year that Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, went down to visit the king of Israel. And the king of Israel said to his servants, do you know that Ramoth-Gilead is ours, but we hesitate to take it out of the hand of the king of Syria? And so they make this pact that they're going to join forces. In verse 4, will you go with me to fight at Ramoth-Gilead? Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses. And even later we see that they intermarry with one another. And it says later in this very chapter, in verse 44, also Jehoshaphat made peace with the king of Israel. And so it would seem that this division that's lasted for several decades is now going to come to an end. And what a glorious thing it would seem that this would be, that this nation that's been split and torn asunder would be able to get back together. But notice how God viewed this. 2 Chronicles 19. 2 Chronicles 19. And this is after they come back from one of the battles that they have. And Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, chapter 19, verse 1 of 2 Chronicles. Then Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, returned safely to his house in Jerusalem. And Jehu, the son of Hanani, the seer, went out to meet him and said to King Jehoshaphat, should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Therefore the wrath of the Lord is upon you. Peace, peace, where there is no peace. My people as your people. My servants, your servants. My horses, your horses. Let's be together on this. Let's intermarry with one another. We are one kindred people. We're one nation, and we can be unified and have peace with one another. And God was not pleased with it. And the reason being is because peace between people cannot exist if there is not first peace with God. That is foundational. That is fundamental. And that has to come first. And the reason being is because just because there's an absence of hostilities, that no one's speaking about these things that have caused issues and problems over the years or over whatever time period it's been, that just because that doesn't exist does not mean that there is peace if things have not been made right with our God. What we're talking about then is we're talking about mindsets. We're talking about the way in which people look at things and perspectives that people have. Jeroboam had a certain mindset that made it easy for him to rebel against the king. Rehoboam had a mindset that made it very easy for him to not listen to the elders of his time. And both of these things led to their destruction and their ultimate ruin as nations. Israel faster than Judah, but at the end of the day, they both ended up the same. And so we have to be aware, as Jesus says, to beware of what's called leaven. Leaven, if you remember, is basically the same as what we talk about with yeast. A little bit is placed within a measure of bread, and that leaven spreads itself out and causes it to rise and affects every part of whatever it is that it's put inside. Most of the time in the scriptures, this idea of leaven, this word leaven, is used in a negative context about things that are bad and evil that are spreading, that we need to be careful of. Paul says this about it in Galatians chapter 5, and he's got some very strong words about it as well. Galatians 5, starting at verse 7. He tells the Galatian brethren, "You ran well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion," notice that word, "this persuasion does not come from him who calls you." He's already talked about many times in this letter doctrine. Here he talks about persuasion. Also in this letter he talks about those who will court you zealously. And so what Paul is addressing is not just the idea that people are teaching you something wrong, but they're persuading you and they're courting you. A little leaven, he says in verse 9, leavens the whole lump. I have confidence in you, in the Lord, that you will have no other mind. But he who troubles you shall bear his judgment, whoever he is. And I, brethren, if I still preach circumcision, why do I still suffer persecution? Then the offense of the cross has ceased. I could wish that those who trouble you were even cut themselves off, he says in verse 12. He has some very strong language for it. It's not just the doctrines that are taught. For the most part, we don't typically lose people to huge doctrinal issues all at once. We start losing them through a way of looking at things, a mindset. Either a looseness in taking away something that God has bound, or in a strictness in binding something that God has not bound. And they run to extremes on those positions. And when they start to do that, it may not be that the thing that they have chosen is necessarily a wrong thing on either end. But they begin to have that mindset that that is not a way, but it's the way. And because of that, it causes problems. And a little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump. You think about some of the issues that none of us can put an absolute standard on. Think about something even like modesty. How short is too short? How long should a dress be? How tight should it be? And those are things which upon a scale, we can't point at one particular place on that and say, this is the absolute standard that God has set. And so you'll have people all over the scale on that, some to the extreme positions on both sides. However, there's a mindset that can start interfering to persuade and then ultimately to divide about something even like that. That's why we have to be so careful about rightly dividing the word of truth, to not add to and to not take away, because both of them can be equally as destructive, just as it was with Jeroboam and Rehoboam. So to beware of this leaven. Jesus warned about it as well. I want us to notice three versions of accounts in the life of Christ. The first one in Mark chapter 8. And when we see in Mark and Matthew in just a moment, we'll see Matthew, that these are parallel accounts, but they're told a little bit differently with slightly different details. In Mark chapter 8, and starting at verse 11, it says, the Pharisees came out and began to dispute with Jesus, seeking from him a sign from heaven, testing him. But Jesus says, sighed deeply in his spirit. And he asked the question, why does this generation seek a sign? Surely I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation. And he left them, and getting into the boat again, departed to the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than one loaf with them in the boat. Then he charged them, saying, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And we know the story that's almost comical if it wasn't so sad. And they began to reason among themselves because we didn't bring any bread with us. One of the things that leaven will cause us to do is to not be able to see things very clearly. It blurs our vision. Jesus had just fed multitudes. And he had not just fed the multitudes, but he had taken up extra. There were leftovers from feeding the multitudes. So it wasn't that he just met the need of the hunger, but it was so much they couldn't eat it all. So why would Jesus be telling them to not take leaven from the Pharisees? Because we didn't bring any bread. It's very easy when we're influenced by different thoughts and preconceived ideas to lose the real sight, the real vision. I think the Apostle Paul suffered from this as well. In Acts 23 and verse 1, and this is one of the way it shows itself, is in Acts 23 verse 1, Paul talks about he had lived in all good conscience until that day. And he's talking about how it was that he had persecuted Christians, but he did it in all good conscience. One of the things that often people get confused on is the difference between conscience and feelings. Most people will talk about, well, it makes me feel uncomfortable, so it violates my conscience. That has nothing to do with your conscience. That is your feelings. That is your emotions. Conscience is only as good as what it's been trained or taught to do. Paul was taught about Judaism. And Paul was taught that people who assault Judaism and the God of heaven, these are the kinds of things that are supposed to be done for them. And so he was very, very zealous to do those things. He had that mindset already that the king that was coming, as the Pharisees taught, was going to be this conquering king and conquer the nations. And that mindset influenced Paul. But he felt fine about doing it. And he also did it in all good conscience because that's what his conscience was trained to do. I've been researching this for a little while now, and one of the things that I came across that was horrific but also very interesting was this. They talked to a bunch of abortion doctors and abortion nurses. And these individuals believed wholeheartedly that what they were doing was right, that this was not killing a life, that it ought to be legal, and no one should be opposed to it. They did those things in all good conscience. However, the greater majority of them could not bear to look at the aborted fetus because it hurt their feelings, their emotion, but it did not bother their conscience. That's the difference between the two. There's a lot of things that as Christians we're asked to do that are going to be difficult things to do that we're not going to want to do emotionally speaking, but it ought to bother my conscience to not do it. For example, the Bible tells us that we're supposed to mark those who walk disorderly and cause divisions within the Lord's body. I don't want emotionally to do that. These may be family members even. I don't want emotionally to do that. However, it ought to bother my conscience to not do it. And I ought to be able to do it in all good conscience, even if it hurts my feelings to do so. Again, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And if we're not careful, the mindset that we adopt can blur the line between conscience and emotion and our feelings about something. In Acts 24 and verse 16, Paul, in still recounting his conversion and his former life and giving an account of himself, Acts 24 and verse 16, Paul has this to say, "This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and man." What we're supposed to be doing is training our conscience, always seeking to educate it and get it to where it's supposed to be. Also, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Beware of the leaven. Let's look at Matthew's account of this incident. Matthew 16 and verse 12. Matthew 16 and verse 12. Jesus has the same encounter with his disciples. He says in verse 6, to take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Again, verse 7, it's because we brought no bread. And Jesus reminds them of what happened. And then in verse 12 it says, then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And so Matthew gives us a little bit more in that Mark just tells us, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Beware of the leaven of them. Here we understand that what Jesus is talking about is their teaching. A little false teaching, a little error has a leavening influence. and can spread out in a lot of different ways. We have to be on guard. Luke 18, verse 9, one of the ways that it can show itself is this, is that you have this Pharisee who goes up to pray. And when he's there in the temple, he's highly educated. He knows the things of the law. He's one that trusts in himself that he is righteous, and it causes him to despise others. When you have teaching the way that this Pharisee had been taught, this is what it can lead to. One of the problems that I know that we often confess to one another that we have to be careful of is being arrogant, or coming off as being arrogant and prideful, or that we despise other people and hate other people when that's not the case. This Pharisee trusted in himself that he was righteous, and he despised others. And he thanked God that he was not like other men, even like this tax collector that's over here. But he didn't go to his house justified. The other one did. And the reason being is because that's what their teaching resulted in. But again, it starts with that same mindset, that same way of looking at things. The Scriptures weren't given to me so that I might exalt my righteousness above others and despise others who don't meet the same standards that I do. That's not what the Scriptures were given to me for. They were given to me that I might be just like this tax collector and not be able to raise my eyes to heaven, but rather beat upon my breast and say, God be merciful to me, a sinner. That's why they were given to me. But again, if we get that confused, if our teaching doesn't emphasize that, we miss the point. And it can lead in all sorts of destructive ways. It can prevent us from leading honest lives as well. If you go back in Luke to chapter 12 and verse 1, another place where Jesus uses this. And this is sort of at the end of what seems to be similar to Matthew's 23, the woes pronounced upon the scribes and the Pharisees and the lawyers. But Luke 12 and verse 1, it says that in the meantime, when an innumerable multitude of people had gathered together, so that they trampled one another, he began to say to his disciples, first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Here he doesn't say it's doctrine. Here he says it's hypocrisy, which is another thing that this mindset, this teaching, what it will lead to. It leads to hypocrisy, playing the part. The Pharisees were very good about playing the part of righteous religious people, but they weren't interested in the things of God, but only the things of themselves. They didn't think they were. The same as the people in Isaiah and Jeremiah's time didn't think they were. They very much thought they were on God's side. Paul very much thought he was on God's side as well. But that's what a little leaven does. It causes such divisions as that. 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 6. How blurry is our vision oftentimes when it comes to this passage. 1 Corinthians 5. This man has his father's wife. The church has not dealt with him. And in verse 6, Paul says, your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? And so when Paul writes in verses 9 through 12 and 13, that I wrote to you not to keep company with people who are sexually immoral, such as this young man is. I wasn't talking about people in the world. I was talking about anyone named a brother who is sexually immoral, to not even eat with such a one. Why doesn't that happen? Why doesn't it happen? Our vision gets blurry. Because somewhere along the way somebody said, well, was not family. He's not a Christian anymore. He's withdrew from us first. There's a lot of different things that happen, and that little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump. It doesn't change the verse at all. What about the way in which it's taught? Do people teach that you don't have to do that? Or they limit where God did not limit? Or loose where God did not loosen? Does it cause us to just completely live dishonest lives? Yes, I know that's what God said, but, however, and this is just one example, I can't live a life of integrity. I can't live a life of honesty. I can't be at peace with my God when I'm trying to obtain peace through these things that are nothing more than leaven, and how they're going to spread, and how disruptive they're going to be. Again, brethren, it's a mindset that we have to be careful to guard against and to watch out for that creeps in. In Romans 10, verses 1 and 2, Paul had talked about how much he loved his brethren, the nation of Israel. And in chapter 9, talked about how he would even give his own soul if it would save theirs. And in chapter 10, he says, my heart's desire and prayer for them is that they may be saved. I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but it's not according to knowledge. And so these people who are very, very zealous for God, that Paul loved and appreciated how zealous they were still going to be lost. It did no one any good to ignore that and pretend it didn't exist. And that mindset needed to be cast out if they ever wanted to be saved. Don't say peace, peace when there is no peace, where it doesn't exist. It doesn't help. It doesn't heal. It only makes a person feel a little bit better while they're bleeding to death. It doesn't help at all. And so you turn to a passage like Matthew 23, and the Prince of Peace in Matthew 23. Is this a peaceful discourse? Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, over and over and over again. But he begins by telling the multitude and his disciples that they sit in Moses' seat. Whatever they tell you to do, observe and to do, but don't do according to their works, for they say and they do not do. So Jesus gives them the right perspective. Don't be like somebody like Jeroboam. Jeroboam did not agree with Rehoboam, so he took the people off somewhere else, and we saw what ended up with it. Jesus says, look, they sit in that seat of authority. You do what they tell you to do. Whether you like it or not, just don't do what they do, because that's what's wrong. And then he turns to the scribes and the Pharisees, and he points out how it is that they love the greetings, and they love the titles, and they love to rob widows' houses. And he reminds them that you are very zealous. You'll travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he's won, you make him twice the son of hell as you are yourself. Cleanse the inside, and the outside will be taken care of. Don't just look like a whitewashed tomb. You brood of vipers. You children of snakes is what that means. The Prince of Peace. Is that a peaceful discourse? Let me ask you this. Why did Jesus say those things? Was it because he hated the Pharisees? Did Jesus say those things to the people and the disciples so that the people and the disciples would hate the Pharisees? Or did Jesus say those things because they were the truth, and that was the only means of arriving at true peace? He went to the mountain and he wept. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I would have gathered you like a hen gathers its chicks, but you weren't willing. Jesus was not going to be guilty of speaking peace, peace, when there is no peace. Proverbs 3 and verse 12 tells us that whom the Lord loves, he chastens. He rebukes everyone that he loves, just like a father does with a child in whom he takes pleasure. That's why he did that. And so here's really the point of this. Charlie and I have a tremendous responsibility. And that responsibility is not about just guarding against false doctrine, but it's also guarding against mindsets that creep in. And so often we do get questions about, why is it that you can't be supportive of this particular congregation or that group of people or this particular activity? Why can't you just give your approval to that? We can't. And it may not be because there's something that's absolutely wrong there, but there is a mindset that's there. Let me ask you this, fathers. You have a guy that wants to date your daughter, and he hasn't done anything wrong yet, but there's just something about the way he looks at things that you don't like. Why can't you just let your daughter date him? We understand that in every other aspect of life. But when it comes to things of a spiritual nature, we often try to ignore it. And we become like Jeroboam. It's very easy for Jeroboam to rebel against the king. He's done it before, he'll do it again. And so you have people who constantly cause divisions and splits wherever they go because they've always got a problem with something. Then you got people like Rehoboam. It's very easy for him to not listen to the elders. I'll agree with the elders so long as they're saying what I want them to say, but as soon as they tell me something else, I'm not listening to that. You constantly run into those attitudes. And that mindset, that disposition, brethren, is dangerous. And so we have a responsibility to guard against that as well, which shows the wisdom in God making local congregations autonomous from one another. Because what happens here, if it's wrong, it doesn't affect other congregations because we're autonomous from one another. But if we were joining ourselves together constantly, and some brethren have had this problem over the years, well, preachers will get together and have studies with one another, which in and of itself is not a wrong, bad thing. But here's a danger behind it. If I go in and speak to a gathering of 30 or 40 preachers, and I give a lesson on a topic like Romans 14, or marriage, divorce, and remarriage, or fellowship, or any of these other topics that cause so much trouble, with one lesson, I've now affected 30 or 40 congregations with that one lesson. Whereas before, it would take me to having to go to 30 or 40 congregations before it would affect them. You see the difference? It's not that that was wrong to have that study, but we have to be careful about the way in which we do things, because a little leaven leavens the whole lump. God was wise in the way that he did things, and we need to respect that. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 19, here's the application. 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 19. Paul, in rebuking the congregation for the way in which they've carried on in their divisive manner in so many different ways. And in verse 19 he says, "For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you." There's going to be times when there is no peace. It's not our desire. It's not what God wants either. But we can never say peace, peace, when there is no peace. I know the brethren here stand strong. I've seen you stand strong. I've seen you struggle with how to deal with different circumstances over this past 10 years that I've been with you. And I've admired you for that, and how strongly you stood in the midst of some really tough situations and circumstances. I commend you to continue that. And if you need help with that, please let us know so that we can talk with you about those things, so that you can understand why it is that maybe Charlie and I can't approve of certain things. We have no problem being asked this. I asked him last night if he was okay with this lesson. He said, yeah. So go at it. Because sincerely, we don't have an issue with that. We do want to talk. We do want to have open communication about whatever it may be. And brethren, we don't want to shy away from anything that may be difficult for us, because that's not going to glorify our God. So my question I'm going to leave with you is this, is what is your idea of peace? What does it actually look like? Is it peace, peace when there is no peace? Or is it the peace that the God of peace gives? Let's seek the latter and to be pleasing to him. If you're subject to the invitation tonight, maybe because you failed in some of these areas, or maybe you need some help in these areas, or because you want to obey the gospel so that Christ can be your king, whatever that may be this night, let us know as together we stand and sing. We'll be glad to help.